Welcome, everyone. I'm Emmeline Nathans, ASBA's Programs and Operations Coordinator, and I'm joined today by Green Committee Chair Myra Storks. We are pleased you could join us today for our first Green Committee webinar, Drawing Attention to Climate Change with Sharon Field, 3,000 Days and Counting. Go ahead, Myra.
Hello, my name is Myra Storks, and I'm the chair of ASBA's Green Committee. The Green Committee originated from a goal in the strategic plan to capitalize on the power of botanical art to promote environmental stewardship, ecological sustainability, and plant conservation. It's a mouthful, but timely and important. The committee is working on a few projects, one of which is this annual webinar series. Why did we choose Sharon Field to inaugurate this series? Because her work exemplifies how our art can have an impact in the world. Sharon has long emphasized outreach with her art. In 2017, she received an ASBA artist grant to record the unusual loss of a eucalyptus tree native to New South Wales in Australia. This project involved collaborations with people from many disciplines, workshops for children, exhibitions, and more. And offshoots from it have continued to sprout since then. Sharon is Australian, as many of you know. She has worn a lot of hats, all of them interesting. She was a teacher. She worked for several years with Australia's aid program in Africa and the Pacific. She was a volunteer firefighter for 20 years. She has a very large garden in which she has single-handedly planted hundreds of trees. She's been a full-time artist for 15 years. She's won numerous awards, and her art has been exhibited widely in Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US. Sharon is on the board of ASBA and currently chairs the Artist Grants Committee. Everything I have said about her is accurate, but what is even more remarkable about her is that she is intrepid and absolutely inspired.
Thank you, Myra. And today, Sharon will discuss her efforts to combat climate change through her scroll project. She'll explain her process as she continues to add to the already over 25-meter-long scroll, which features more than 750 drawings of plants and their pollinators. Sharon will also talk about the response and the impact of this large-scale project. If you have any questions during this talk, please type them into the Q&A and we'll have Sharon answer them at the end of the program. All those who registered will receive a recording link within 24 hours, and that recording will be available for viewing for 1 week. And just a reminder, all money raised from this webinar will go to ASBA's Acorn Fund, a special fund to fund special projects. Without further ado, we are thrilled to have Sharon with us today to share her incredible journey with this inspiring project. Sharon, please begin.
Thank you, Emmeline and Myra, and thank you, ASBA. And hello, everyone. This is a journey that I've been going on for about 2 years now, just over 2 years. It started as a personal response to what I could see was happening in our natural world as a result of cataclysmic climate change. I did not, and I do not, like what is happening. So while this began as a personal challenge, 3,000 Days and Counting has grown, not only in its physical size, but also in its significance for a growing number of people around the world. So my talk to you today will cover the following areas. Very briefly, the influences on my thinking for this artwork, then the specific trigger, how I select materials and work on the scrolls, and the reactions I get. And finally, where's it going? What's next? So who am I? Well, I call myself a botanical artist, but like each of you, I'm also the sum of my experiences, which have been many and varied. And I believe that these experiences and influences have played a really critical role in shaping what's important to me as a botanical artist. But first, I want to take you back in time just for a moment. 10 years ago, in 2014, ASBA's founder, Diane Bouchier, gave a keynote address at ASBA's annual general meeting and conference in Denver, Colorado. I wasn't there and I haven't met Diane, but Diane commented on a number of important issues, and one of her observations in particular was prescient. Diane said, "It has rightly been said that you can't love what you don't know. It's hard to love in the abstract. Yes, we can say we love freedom, but unless we feel an immediate threat to our freedoms, we're often slow to take action. And yes, we love the planet, but that love is so much more focused when it has its roots in a personal knowledge of the nature that will be destroyed if we fail to protect it." 2.5 years into my project, Diane's observations have never rung more truly than now. And I found that through our botanical artwork generally, individuals and communities are starting to take more notice of what we have, the threats that we and our environment face, and therefore what we might lose. But I believe we need to do more. I want to look very briefly at the influences on my thinking for this artwork, because you'll see how a number of serendipitous but parallel paths have actually worked together to create an artwork that I now call 3,000 Days and Counting. So a little bit about my normal art practice. Everything I do has a story, and it has a memory embedded in the work. I rarely do a drawing or painting just for the sake of doing something. And I find that for me, I do better work when the subject has meaning. And for me, lichens are pretty amazing little creatures. Despite growing in environments that to us appear incredibly unforgiving and harsh, they endure. They were all on the planet before people arrived and will probably outlive us all. Often found on rocks and trees, this very simple little lichen was growing beneath a tree, having chosen as its support a cast metal garden table. And this piece of metal has become its enduring place of residence. Exposed to the elements and clinging to the metal, it's become a beautiful work of art in its own right. And butterflies, they have an ethereal beauty. They start out dancing in living light, but their time in the spotlight is very short. Like the leaf, each has its role to play in the cycle of light and life. And while it may be brief, it's an important component of that web of life of which we are also a part. Pine cones in their early lives are very sedate and quite tightly controlled. And this particular pine cone was opening in response to a change in air pressure as a rainstorm was coming over. It was preparing to release its seeds. The Australian black and sulphur-crested cockatoos have learned about this cycle of seed release with a change in the weather, and they decided they'd come to feast on the seeds held by each scale in the pine cone. So the birds have created their own sculptural forms from this pine cone. Now, I want you to remember this pine cone image in particular because I will refer to it later. And these are just two other little pieces that really spoke to me, spoke to my heart. The first is the Gymea lily, which lives in a very specific geographic location on the sandstone-derived soils around Sydney. They're very ancient and exceptionally tall plants growing up to 6 meters or 20 feet in height. And they go way back in history. And this beautiful little hibiscus flower, which is painted on vellum, was given to me by a very elegant elderly lady. The bloom was fresh when it was given to me, but it's developed character as the day wore on, just like its giver. Next, let's look at an ASBA artist grant, which prompted my thinking about an environmental issue in a very different way. In 2017, I received a grant from ASBA to fund a project based in the Monero region in New South Wales, Australia. I explained in my grant application that south of where I lived, I had seen dead eucalyptus trees everywhere. And I wondered why had so many trees died? I discovered that this phenomenon of mass deaths of a species was called quite simply dieback. And it resulted in this case from drought and changed rainfall patterns because of climate change. And this had a massive and sobering impact on the area. And it's an area, a very significant area. It's 2,000 square kilometres or 770 square miles. And it was once dominated by a really majestic eucalypt, and it's been turned into a graveyard. Dieback has been reported in other species of tree in Australia and around the globe. And my personal challenge was to try to tell the story of what had been lost and the impacts of this, because often environmental change is incremental and invisible. But the loss of each one of these trees caused a flow-on effect, which was a catastrophic loss in biodiversity over the whole area. I wanted to attract people's attention and interest. I wanted to tell a story about what was happening. And this artwork, Monero Runes, tells that story in 3 books. So now let's look at the practice of journaling. My move into journaling started at the ASBA St. Louis conference in 2018, where I was reporting back on my Monero Runes project. And it was here that I met and saw Lara Gastinger working on her perpetual journal. I'd not done any journal work before that. And after the conference, having seen Lara at work, I plucked up the courage to give it a go, as you see here. And my perpetual journal is now into its 5th year. By doing this journal, I also began to learn a lot more about plants and their relationships with each other, as well as with insects and birds. It aroused my curiosity about nature in a new and different way. In my journal, I draw nothing in pencil, I just use pen and watercolour. Lara's rules, as I'm sure many of you will know. In addition to my perpetual journal during the first year of COVID, during lockdown, I did a drawing a day for 365 days on 12 large sheets, 1 sheet for each month. I had no theme, and this was just an interesting exercise more than anything else. And here you can see one of my COVID sheets. I use very little colour except to highlight very small things here and there on each sheet. So how does this link to my scrolls? Well, I think that you can see that the idea of a scroll as a format became a logical progression. In a way, the scroll is a bit like a journal, but on an epic scale. It's almost journaling on steroids when you think about it. Then I asked myself, why did I want to do a project on climate change? At this point, I pondered on the history of botanical art, because over millennia, botanical art has always responded to the needs of the time in which it was being made. Knowing this history provided me with a bedrock for the scrolls. So if you think about it, in the Middle Ages, botanical art supported the work of apothecaries and medics. In the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, botanical artists travelled the world with explorers, recording plants new to European eyes in the Americas, Pacific, Africa and Asia. And today, we see much of our botanical artwork focusing on species at risk. I'm not going into the history of botanical art here, except to say that I see the scrolls as being one small part of this tradition. As I said, botanical art has always responded to the needs of the time in which it was being made. So, here am I. What are the needs of my time as I see them? It's the 21st century, and the biggest issue of my time, as I see it, is the climate and biodiversity crisis. So I wondered, okay, well, what can I do? I could sit down, bury my head in the sand, wring my hands and do nothing, or I could use my art to try to do something, and I wanted to do something. So let's have a look at the influence of environmental issues on this artwork. For a long time, I've been concerned about environmental issues and the negative impact people have on the natural environment. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, sometimes intentional, often unintentional. But for over 100 years, scientists and activists have tried their level best to bring about an awareness of the reasons for the changing climate and the impact that that's having on the natural environment. However, there have been campaigns of misinformation and disinformation by global oil companies, governments and the media everywhere that have buried and distorted the science. Little wonder that people are confused. The messages coming through often just don't make sense. So, what on earth does 418 parts per million of carbon dioxide mean? I don't know. And many people find it really difficult to comprehend these messages. And then there's all the disaster reporting: fires, floods, tornadoes, famine. The problems of global warming are very real and just so big and so overwhelming. And it is scary. The result is that people switch off. They just don't know who to believe or what to do. So I thought, okay, well, what can I do? At home, I planted hundreds of trees. That's a bit of my garden, you can see at the top. I've decreased my use of plastics. I live in the country, so I ensure any trip I do to town is a multi, not a single purpose trip. And I've consciously planted flowering plants for the bees and the birds, and I try to do what I can to protect the microbiome beneath the surface of the soil. And for a long time, my botanical art has had an environmental message. Still, I felt that I needed to do more. So how could these 5 influences all roll together to become a coherent artwork and not cause more confusion? So let's have a look at the very specific trigger for 3,000 days and counting. There was a report written by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published at the end of 2021, which warned that we need to keep the global temperature down below a 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degree Fahrenheit rise by 2030. Now, I know we've already surpassed that in many parts of the globe, but I'm talking about when I began this artwork. So at that time, I thought about 2030, and at that time, 2030 was 3,000 days away. For me, this brought a lot of those climate messages home in a big way. 3,000 days, it's not a lot of time. It also acted as a linchpin for those influences that we just covered. So as a botanical artist, I believe that my role was clear, and I set myself a challenge to do a drawing a day for the next 3,000 days to highlight this issue. Very easy said, but I decided I would call this project 3,000 Days and Counting. Okay, so now I had a mission and a title, but how could I do a drawing a day? What form would this take? I could have painted a series of very discrete images like you saw earlier on, or created a specific purpose journal, but none of these approaches would have served my purpose, so I decided on a scroll. Why? I wanted to tell a story, and for that story to remain as a single and dramatic artwork. I wanted people to remember the story, to talk about the issues, and to feel strongly enough about the issues to want to take some sort of action. I began drawing on Earth Hour Day, the 26th of March, 2022. And to date, I've completed over 800 drawings. In fact, yesterday was my 810th drawing, one a day since I first began. My next challenge was to work out how to actually work on the scroll. So my supplies, pretty simple, no different to doing a journal really. I use Arches Hot Press 300 GSM or 140-pound watercolour paper, which I buy in a big roll, and I cut it into strips of about 15 inches or 37 centimetres high. Each roll is about 10 yards or just over 9 metres long. I use the Pigma Micron pens, as you can see there, 2 sizes, 003 and 005, and watercolour paints. But illustrating the scroll is an interesting process because I can only work on one small section of the scroll at a time, as you see there. Drawing on the scroll is not planned out in the same way I would prepare for and plan out the details of a single artwork. As I said, the paper is 9 metres or 10 yards long, and I have to keep placing one drawing after the other because I have only a couple of feet available to me at any one time. Because of the size of the scrolls, I can't twist or turn it either. It's just too bulky. So I have to sit square to it, which sometimes is difficult. All the drawings are in pen. Nothing is done in pencil. So these next few slides are images from scroll number 3, which I'm just in the process of coming to the end of now. And it demonstrates some of the different techniques I use. Here, my approach to some subjects is fairly linear. lines either on their own or with watercolour or a mix of both. On the left is a Cootamundra wattle, an Australian wattle. In the middle is a little Australian beetle called a cowboy beetle. And on the right is a sequoia tip, and these sequoias live not far from where I live. These drawings are a little bit more sketchy. When it was given to me, this little moth that you see here was very old. It was just disintegrating. But I decided to include it because it's a newly discovered species in Australia and limited to a very specific coastal habitat, which is why that bit of coastal weed is sitting below it. And on the right is an Aaron's rod or greater mullein. That's a weed here in Australia, but I just love those seed pods and the patterns that they formed. Here are a few more sketchy pieces. You can see a line tracking through some of these images, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. But you can also see the variety of subjects I'm including on the scroll. Left, we have a Shasta daisy. In the centre, the pupae of a wood moth, and then two different types of fungi on the right-hand side. I also use stippling. This is not the very formal approach to stippling that you would see for a scientific publication, but it still gets the message across. On the left is a little Perrin's tree frog, an Australian frog. Top is the periwinkle or vinca. The centre at the bottom is the Banksia integrifolia. Now, this Banksia was collected by Joseph Banks in his voyage with Captain Cook in 1770. This was the first Banksia collected. And on the right is an Australian lomandra, which is an important plant in Aboriginal history and culture. Here's a little sequence of drawings showing a plant from its early stages to the finished piece on the scroll. I don't have time to do full watercolour paintings on the scroll, so I use a pen which is starting to run out of ink to do the tonal work on the subject, and then I apply my colour with watercolour. In a way, some of the drawings and paintings end up looking like coloured etchings. Others look like works in graphite. But I should say that I'm also usually too busy drawing that I rarely think of taking process photos. Now here's a little time lapse of me drawing. And my process is very similar to that which we've seen Lara Gastinger doing in her perpetual journal. I mark out the structure of the plant very lightly in pen and then draw in the details. I only wish that in real life my pen was able to draw as quickly as it does in this little video clip. And what I'm drawing here is the seed pods from a crepe myrtle. So I work on the scrolls every day, no matter where I am, at home, visiting friends, travelling within Australia or overseas, in a hotel room, motel room, in a caravan or camper van. And I need to work quickly because doing a drawing a day means that I don't have time to procrastinate at all. I have to select a plant and then do it. I can't really change my mind. When I travel, I wrap the scrolls very carefully around a cardboard tube and protect each scroll with a waterproof bag. The wrapped scrolls then go into my backpack. Top left, that's me working at home. Bottom left, this was in Tarrytown a couple of years ago at the ASBA conference. And in the motel room, the table there was far too small to accommodate the scrolls. So I used the ironing board. And that was my perfect drawing table for the period of time I was at the conference. And just at the foot of the ironing board, you can see a tube with a red lid. And that's what the scroll gets wrapped around and then wrapped in plastic before it goes into my backpack. Top right, this was in France, and I was staying with friends in their caravan or camper van. And you can see the tiny table I'm working on there. I'd have to move the scrolls for meals and our red wine dreaming. And then after our meals, we clean the table down. I pull the scroll out and keep working. And I'm drawing a little elderflower at that point. So what do I draw? It's difficult to plan in advance what subjects I'll draw because I need to find something new every day. And I get my subjects from all over, as you can see here. In the bush, the Australian Botanic Gardens in Sydney, from the roadsides. And friends drop things off. So top right, you can see a bag with something in there that the friends have dropped off at my gatepost to say, there's a present for you, Sharon. And when I was at the Tarrytown conference a couple of years ago, I was wandering around the hotel car park with Lara Gastinger and others, trying to find new plants for the scroll. And it was amazing. When we looked, we did very well indeed. And I have a small but dedicated group of friends who have really invested in the scroll in a big way, and they love seeking out new things for me to include. And what I find fascinating about their engagement is that they're now, these are people who aren't necessarily botanical artists, and they're telling me that whenever they go outside, they've become seekers of scroll subjects for me. And this is encouraging them to look more closely at their local habitats, and I think this is fantastic. So I received a call from one of my scroll seekers, Chris, who lives about 5 miles away, and she said she'd found an unusual moth for me. She didn't know what it was. This was in April, and we just had some rain. And I had learned about, well, let me just go back here one more. I had learned about a moth, an Australian moth known as the acacia moth. So Chris is showing me here where she found the moth on this bush, which was right next to a Snowy Mountains acacia, which she's pointing to there. Now, the theory is that this moth lays its eggs beneath the acacia tree in the pupae, and then the moth is released from the ground underneath the acacia bush. So we decided to dive under the bush to see what we could find. And I was just hoping there weren't any snakes having a sleep under that bush, because Chris took the camera and there's me, head down, tail up, underneath this bush. Now, underneath the acacia, there's a lot of leaf litter, a lot of leaves, and the pupae are very, very well camouflaged. But scrabbling around there, we did manage to find something, and you'll see I'm just pointing to something there. I don't know whether you can see that easily. There's a tiny little bit of orange that I'm pointing to. So I'm getting that out. Now this moth only hatches. So there's part of a little pupae case. It's broken off in half. This hatches only once a year in April, and the little moth doesn't live for very long. And there you see, there's the full pupae case. So that was a great find. And bottom right on this image, you can see there's the moth with the pupae case all included. So how do I select subjects to include on the scroll? Wherever I go, I include native plants, exotic plants, weeds, insects, and so on. Because for me, every plant is important, because with climate change, every plant is now at risk, along with their pollinators and other ecosystem partners. While the fundamental basis of the scroll is botanical, I include a range of other critters because I want to show that plants do not and cannot exist in isolation. So you'll see insects, reptiles, spiders, birds, fungi, and so on. They don't dominate. The dominant subject is the botanical subjects. But I include plants that have been introduced to Australia too, because in my country, we now have more introduced species than we have native species. And here there are a few images from Vienna, where I was working with the lovely Margareta Pertl and her team. I had access to the beautiful botanic gardens there, and in Viskri, Romania, there were plants everywhere in the meadows. It was just wonderful. And what I find really interesting is that people everywhere will find numerous images on the scroll that they can recognise and respond to. The scrolls are universal and they're not tied to a particular location. And I must say that the photographic images on the scroll don't do the scroll justice. So I'm hoping that if you come to Pittsburgh in October this year, you can see the real thing. Now I've recorded the details of everything on the scrolls. On the actual scroll, each image, that's the image on the left, each image has a reference number counting down from 3,000. If the number has an asterisk, it means it's an Australian native. And if there's no asterisk, it means that the subject is non-native to Australia. This information I also record in a written journal, which includes the image reference number in the left-hand column, the date it was drawn in the central column, and the scientific and common names and the story about the subject in the right-hand column, along with the location I sourced that particular image or subject. And the stories are really about the relationships of the plants with insects, and also about the cultural uses of the plants, because I think people are interested in that aspect of plants, and that's what they'll remember. So people ask, okay, well, all the scrolls look the same. Will all 9 scrolls look the same? And I estimate that there will be about 8 or 9 scrolls altogether, and each will be a little bit different. The main subject, botanical subjects, will remain constant, but each scroll will have a different visual theme and will be presented differently. For example, scroll 1, which you see here, is called Biodiversity, Nature's Embrace, Rich and Bold. And it shows the chaos and beauty of nature in all its complexity. Because when I started this project, I really didn't know what I was doing. I was just drawing and drawing whatever I found. It was just a crazy idea I had. And then I realized that to do 8 or 9 scrolls all the same would be boring. Boring for me to do and boring for anyone to look at. So I did some red wine dreaming. I found a NASA graph. This is the National Aeronautical Space Administration Agency in America. A NASA graph which shows global temperature increases from 1880 up to the present day. And I realized that this shows a really interesting set of information. When you break down the peaks and troughs, you can see the impact of industrialization at the end of the 19th century. There's that peak just before 1900. The impact of World War I, the peak just before 2020. The impact of World War II around 1940. And the rapid increase in industrial activity after that. Then, of course, from the late 1960s on, global temperatures just gallop away with the increasing use of fossil fuels. Now, I decided that this information was so stark and so dramatic that I wanted to try to incorporate it into my artwork in some way or another. But at this stage, I didn't know how I could use the information. As I said, people close off when they're confronted with statistical information, and I wanted to show this information in a way that would draw them in. So, back to the red wine dreaming. Scroll number 2. This scroll is called The Bush Whispers Softly of Changes Profound. And here you can see that global rising temperature from the NASA graph from 1880 up to 2030 weaving through the plants. When a plant crosses through that graph line, I've left the image in black and white, as you see, and you can see the global rising global temperature when the scroll is rolled out in full on a table. It's picked out quite clearly. The horizontal line running along the base of the scroll has all the dates from 1880 to 2030, one after the other for the whole 10 yards. Scroll number 3. Scroll number 3, Nature Trembles and Sighs at the Warming Embrace, shows the same NASA global temperature graph line. But this time, when a plant crosses that graph line, I'm doing that part of the plant in colour, with all the drawing on either side of the graph line in black and white, which is the reverse of scroll number 2. And the final scroll, number 8 or 9, will show all the plants in Australia that have become extinct or are critically endangered. Now I'm going to have to use herbarium specimens or photographs or explorer sketches for that scroll. Australia has a poor record of plant extinction, so I want to highlight that. So the visual message will become more serious as the scrolls develop, reflecting the serious climate situation we're in. Climate change has the consequence of reducing biodiversity, and that's catastrophic, not only for the environment, but also for us. The drawings will remain very beautiful and detailed, but the message will become more serious. So, how have people reacted to the scrolls? The very first time I showed the scroll to people was at the ASBA conference in New York, in Tarrytown, in October 2022. ASBA, I must say, has been an absolutely fantastic supporter of me and the scroll. And in Australia, I've also got 2 other supporters, along with the Ginninderry Conservation Trust here in Canberra. So that's Tarrytown top left, Ginninderry bottom, and the Climart Gallery in Melbourne in Australia. And Margareta Pertl and her team in Vienna, Austria have been fantastic as well. So when the scroll is rolled out in public, I usually find that there's an intake of breath, and it does generate a strong emotional response and a few tears. So here's a short video of me rolling the scroll out in Vienna, and it gives you some idea of how long the scroll is. In Vienna, I had the 2 scrolls with me, one on each side of the table, and each scroll is about 9 meters or 30 feet long. So as a form of journal, the scrolls provide the basis for quite a rich discussion about environmental issues in a very non-threatening way. They're designed to be beautiful so that they draw people in rather than repel them. And people become happy to talk about the issues and what more they can do. So after they've had a time to look at the scrolls, people start talking, and they often ask me, but what can I do? This question, and the excuses up there on the screen, often become the catalyst for discussion. And I find that people can provide their own examples of problems or successes or concerns or ideas on what they can do. And in turn, I can share information about some of the fantastic initiatives I've learned about from others as a result of people talking about the scroll. And just a couple of examples here, I've learned about the No Mo May movement in the UK, and I believe it's operating in some parts of America as well. The rewilding of the city of Vancouver. Cornell Botanic Gardens, in collaboration with Cornell University in the States, which is testing sustainable options for replacing backyard grass with a ground cover, which requires less mowing, less watering, and provides food for insects and birds. And there are many, many more wonderful initiatives out there that people can link with. They just need to be given that information. And themes are starting to emerge through the scroll. For example, the significance of plants in cultural life, for example, in wars, national emblems, festivals, and so on. There are the Flanders poppies for World War I, which we all know about. And when I was in France, I included poppies, those poppies on the scroll. On the left above the little frog, you can see some dried ginkgo leaves. I found these leaves here in Canberra, and they fell from a small tree, which is the daughter tree of the only tree that survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in World War II. When that tree in Hiroshima shed seed after the war, the seed was collected and sent all over the world for other countries to germinate. But the ginkgo in the wild is under threat. It's a very slow adapter. On the right are lotus pods. The lotus is a symbol, an important symbol for Vietnam following the Vietnamese War in the 1970s. It's a symbol of resilience. So both of these events have a very strong significance for the countries they are in, as well as for countries like Australia and the USA and other countries who are involved in those conflicts. So what happens if we start losing plants like these? If we lose the plants, we also start losing parts of our language. And if we lose our language, we start losing our history and our culture. Now, there are also plants that nurture specific insects and birds, as you well know. In this case, we have the Pinus radiata, also known as the Monterey pine. The Monterey pine is a threatened species in its native habitat on the west coast of California and Mexico because of land clearing and development and urban development. In Australia, it's a tree that's hated because people think it causes fire, and the planting of this tree has been banned around Canberra in Australia. Well, it doesn't cause fire, it carries fire, but so do Australian eucalypts. But this tree has become an important food source for some Australian birds, like the beautiful black cockatoos and the sulphur-crested cockatoos, which have had to adapt to eating seeds from this pine tree because land clearing and development has caused the loss of their native food source, which are casuarina trees for these birds. So do you remember that chewed pine cone I showed you earlier? That relates to this story. There are important plants for medicinal and therapeutic purposes as well, which we've forgotten about. This is a little baby scarlet bracket fungi, which has a number of antiseptic qualities and were used by Aboriginal people in Australia to treat mouth infections. And there are scores and scores of plants on the scrolls, which most people consider weeds, which can be used for food, in drinks, salads, and so on. And today, most people only eat food from supermarkets, and it all comes wrapped in plastic. There are amazing stories on the scroll. And this one about the magnolia is, it blows my socks. Magnolias have been on the planet since before bees evolved, and people are amazed to learn this, as was I. How could it be older than bees, because it needs pollinating? But if you think of this plant, it has very tough petals and leaves because it was originally pollinated by beetles. But today, the magnolia is in global decline in the wild because of logging activity, land clearing for agriculture and livestock, collectors of wild plants, and climate change. The magnolia survived for millions of years, and the activities of people are slowly taking its toll. Having said that, though, there are still new discoveries, and people are amazed to learn that we're making new discoveries of everything. So just like the Hiroshima ginkgo, the Wollemi pine in Australia had its seeds sent to botanical gardens all around the world in an effort to save it from extinction. And there are some beautiful Wollemi pines growing in Kew Gardens in London, if ever you get the chance to get there. These are ancient trees that date their lineage back to 91 million years, to the time of the dinosaurs. And during the very fierce fires in 2019 and 2020, along the east coast of Australia, there were fire trucks and water bombing helicopters dedicated to protect this one small pocket of bush where these pine trees live on the outskirts of Sydney. Prior to these fires, which were a consequence of climate change as well, there were over 300 individual trees. Today, there are only 89 trees left in the wild, 46 of which are mature, and there are massive efforts underway to try to save them. I've other plants on the scroll too: the wee jasper grevillea, the Grenfell grevillea, and the Mongalo mallee, all recently discovered in the last 10 to 15 years and endemic to very specific habitats, with the efforts continuing to, an attempt to propagate these beautiful plants. So all of these stories and many more can be found on the scrolls. So these stories lead to discussions about what people see happening in their local area. One interesting discussion is often around the fact that people say, oh, my area is very green, it's really good. But when we get into it, a green environment is not necessarily a biodiverse environment. A green environment can be a desert. For example, green grass or just green trees without a layered understory is not a healthy habitat. In fact, a vacant lot full of weeds has more biodiversity than many tidy, well-mown suburban backyards. People also begin to realise that the hundreds of plants that they see on the scroll may now be at risk, even some very ordinary plants. And as a result, they're keen to find out more about what they can do to help. I find that people want to help. They want to do something, but they don't know what to do. They're not quite sure how to start. So what does all of this mean? Generally, people are very acutely aware of climate change, but day-to-day living is what they focus on. So I believe that our art form, botanical art, has the potential to change the way people view the world. Through our art, they begin to appreciate not only what we have, but also what we might lose, as well as what we can do to positively support our environment and, by doing so, ourselves. If people appreciate the natural world, they're more likely to take care of it. Now, I'm working with the Gin and Dairy Conservation Trust here in Canberra to develop a model for using these scrolls to support community-based public workshops, which I'll talk about more in Pittsburgh. And we're trialling this concept here in Canberra in a week's time. After Pittsburgh, I'll be travelling to France, where I'm giving a public lecture and demonstration in Lyon, organised by ASBA, the French Botanical Art Group. In February next year, a Canberra gallery is turning a room into a gallery studio, where I'll be working on the scrolls each day and talking to people about the process and the issues related to climate change. The gallery also wants to link this exhibition to some seminars with a high-level climate change think tank based at the Australian National University here in Canberra. There's an international climate advocacy group called Climate with an office in Melbourne, and they're working very hard to organise a number of presentations for me here in Australia and in Europe for later this year after Pittsburgh. And the scroll has inspired a musical composition and 2 beautiful poems written by Toby Fay in London. And there are other spin-off activities which link with groups in other parts of the globe, including I'm working with a dance group, an ecological dance group in Taiwan. I'm working with a mixed group of scientists and artists, dancers with Ecuador, with farmers in Ecuador. And none of this would have happened if it was not for this botanical artwork. So think back to the influences I listed at the beginning of my talk. We can bring botanical art to a variety of other people in a new and different way, relevant to the needs of our time. David Attenborough has warned that by the end of this century, there are many plants in existence today that may have been gone forever. And some of the only records of these plants will be either the painted record or in photos or pressed in herbaria. So as botanical artists, if you are a botanical artist, what more can we do? If we really try, we can collectively make a difference through our art, because we, along with plants, animals, insects and fungi, all rely on each other. We can't exist without them, but they would be very happy without us. So can you make a difference by using your art to tell a story? Can you link with friends to do this? How are you responding to the time in which you now live? What's your legacy? So remember Diane Bouchier's advice. Yes, we love the planet, but that love is so much more focused when it has its roots in a personal knowledge of a nature that will be destroyed if we fail to protect it. I'll be showing the scroll live in Pittsburgh at the ASBA conference in October this year, and that presentation will have a different focus to this talk. My talk today was to describe how the scrolls came into being. In Pittsburgh, I want to demonstrate how I use the scrolls for a public presentation beyond the studio in order to make a difference, because I want the scrolls to encourage people to take positive individual and collective action against climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm always in awe at the scale of your project and its inspiring message, but also the quality of your work is just incredible. And not using pencil is so brave to me that it's a beautiful, beautiful work. So we have some questions. One, I think we're all curious about: how much time a day or a week would you say you spend drawing on the scroll, working, submitting, making your drawing your specimen, and the note taking that you do?
It varies a lot. I must say I get very, very excited if I have something very small to do, because I know it's not going to take me very long at all. But if you think back to the Wallamai pine frond, that took me a long time to draw. So I drew it up in a day. I do make sure I do a drawing. So I'm trying to keep myself honest. I do a drawing a day, but I may not finish it on that day. So I'll draw it up the Wallamai pine I drew in a day. The next day I had to draw my next entry, and then I went back to the Wallamai pine to continue the shading. The day following, I did another drawing and then back to the Wallamai pine. So the Wallamai pine may have taken 3 or 4 days to complete, but each day following that, I was doing my new drawing. So it does depend very much on the size of the subject in terms of the length of time. And I'm trying not to just do small things. I do large things because that gives a visual interest on the scroll. But I do get very excited if I find something small to do. So it could be anywhere from, I suppose, a minimum time might be 30 odd minutes up to perhaps a couple of hours. And then depending on the complexity, it might continue over a couple of days.
And a question, what do you do if you make a mistake?
I don't tell anybody. I think one of the things about this is really interesting, and I'm sure Lara Gassinger will back me up here. If you make a mistake, you just get on with it. And the more you do, the less inclined you are to make a mistake. So when you're doing a drawing a day, I've done a drawing a day for 810 days now, I think, you get to be able to look at a plant and do it reasonably well. Now, if I was drawing some of these plants up for a specific artwork, I would take a lot more time, and I would probably, use the eraser to correct and modify things. But this is not about that. It's really a journal. I started it out for myself. It's taken on a different role now. And yeah, there are little errors in there, but hey, I'm not too worried about that. And I haven't made any serious mistakes yet. No serious mistakes. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, knock on wood. We have a question about your titles for your scrolls. How do you come up with each title for your work? And do you refer often to poetic sources for those titles?
For my regular artwork, I do refer to poetic sources. So I've used Shakespeare and I've used poets at different times. But this one, I just played around with titles, and because I've done so many different talks and I've listened to so many, read so many articles and listened to so many people talking about the issues of climate change and biodiversity, the biodiversity crisis, there are little things that my mind captures. So I jot them down as I think of them and then start playing around with them. And because I wanted the titles to reflect the changes, the titles are actually a little story in and of themselves. So it's just playing. And when you're doing a drawing a day, you've got plenty of time to think as well.
Okay, well, we have a question. What advice do you have for a procrastinator?
Pick up your pen and just do it, as Dick Rao would say. He's a real inspiration, because he'd always say, look, stop talking and just do it. Mm-hmm. So procrastinator, just do it.
Great advice. And how do you display the scroll publicly without it getting dirty or damaged by inadvertent viewers? Do you cover with acetate? How do you protect it with all of this storing of it?
The interesting thing about the scroll, because some people or places have said, oh, we want to put it on display on the wall. And I've said, well, no, you can display it, but I want to be able to give them a presentation. I don't want it to be sitting up there on the wall as a static thing. And if it's on the wall, it takes on a different persona almost. So I get people to put tables out, the way Jess the Kelpie is looking at it here now. We roll the scroll out on the table. I don't put anything over it. I just ask people not to come near the scroll with drinks or food or anything like that. Because the whole point of this is it's an artwork that I want people to engage with. I do want them to be able to get up close and have a look at it. I don't want people to be saying, oh, you've got to stand back a metre and you can't get close to it. That's not the point. I want people to engage because there's a message there, and I want them to feel that message, and I want them to take that message away. If something happens, well, something happens, that will become part of the story. Nothing's happened yet, so we'll see.
Well, we have another question about safety. Do you scan your scrolls? Do you have a copy of your scrolls as a backup? I guess it wouldn't quite give it, it's not the real thing. You know, if anything were to happen.
Yeah, if anything were to happen, no, it's not the real thing. No, I don't have an official scan of the scrolls. I've taken occasional photographs, as you've seen here today with my phone, because Gin and Dairy Conservation Trust have done a video, but of scroll number 1, but it's not the same. It just isn't the same as seeing the real thing. And that's why I say, if you've got a chance to go to Pittsburgh, if you want to see the scroll, it will look very different to what you're seeing here on the screen. But in terms of having a record of it, I don't have it because at this stage, it just costs too much. It just costs too much. Yeah, I think people know how much it costs just to get an individual one work scanned professionally.
Mm-hmm.
This is way outside my reach, totally outside my reach.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, as I say, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I have a question. I mean, you said this was sort of journaling on steroids, and you know, often after a long day and you're sitting down to work on your subject for the day, do you ever find that what you pick to paint that day is sort of reflecting your emotions? Is there like sort of like a diary aspect to it? Although I know what you're painting depends on where you are or what's available. Do you find that there's that emotional connection to it?
The emotional connection, I suppose, comes. It's probably a little bit different in that some days I think, oh my God, I have to do another drawing. You know, I just finished doing a drawing perhaps late last night. I wake up the next morning and think, oh no, I've got to find another subject. I have to do another drawing. And you know, my heart sinks. And I think I've got 2,200 of these drawings to go before it's finished. But then what keeps me going is the fact that other people are investing in this now. They're getting a lot out of it. They're providing subjects for me. They provide comment on it through Instagram or emails or whatever. That's what keeps me going. And also the fact that this could become a record of plants that people in future generations may not see anymore. In fact, for Pittsburgh, I have a very interesting exercise which will demonstrate this. I'm not going to talk about it any more than that here now, but I have a very interesting exercise that will demonstrate this quite starkly, where it's an interactive exercise for people with the scroll. So it's a process, but the emotional connection with it comes in a different way. So the drawing is a process, but there is an emotional connection, but it's on a different plane to doing the actual drawing.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. We have a nice comment. You are my hero. This is Lotus McElfish. You are my hero. You have a brilliant botanical art form and message to engage the public in the, and a message to engage the public in this important message of climate change. I applaud you in your mission. Your stories are real gems. I'm glad you're recording them.
Oh, thank you, Lotus. You're a real sweetie, and I love your work too. Thank you.
And another from Sally Petru. I love the red wine dreaming and what it's brought to your evolving skills. The temperature chart being incorporated is just brilliant. So
Thanks,
I think
Sally.
you have a lot of fans, and I think we're all who will attend the conference in Pittsburgh this fall are really looking forward to seeing it in real life, because it's one thing to, you know, see your photos of it, but it's another to really be wowed as you roll it out. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Sharon, for sharing this incredible journey. We really appreciate you coming on and giving us your story.
Thank you very much, Emmeline. Thank you, Myra. And thank you, ASBA. I must say, as I said at the beginning, ASBA has just been such a fantastic supporter. And I know Jodie's probably sitting there in the background, and I think she may have been the initial trigger for this webinar. So thanks to you, Jodie. You've been great as well. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you all for attending. We hope you enjoyed this insight into Sharon's ambitious and inspiring project. There will be a brief survey when the session ends, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. As Sharon and I mentioned, she'll be giving a supplemental talk at our conference in Pittsburgh later this year. Please don't miss this opportunity to see these scrolls firsthand. For more information about ASBA's 30th annual conference, you can go to asba-art.org. We've got all of that information up there now. Please stay tuned for future programming on our website and in your monthly highlights newsletter. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Myra, for bringing this talk to us. And thank you all for attending. All who registered will receive the link within 24 hours for the recording, and you'll have access to that for 1 week. Thank you all. Thank you again, Sharon. I look forward to seeing you in Pittsburgh. Take
Thanks,
care,
everyone.
everyone.